part two of conservation of global biodiversity. So we talked a little bit about what's happening and how species are in decline, population numbers, and genetic diversity, consequently, and also species numbers. And the main threats can be divided up into these 5 categories. So we'll abbreviate it as HIPCO, and each letter in the acronym is one of the threats or one of the challenges for species globally. So habitat loss, invasive species, pollution, climate change, and being overharvested. So habitat loss is pretty self-explanatory. It's just, and deforestation is a great example. Reduction of available habitat for species, plant species as well, by replacement with sort of human influenced landscapes, either for agriculture, industry, or, human settlements where, cities, towns, suburbs, that kind of thing. So, here we can look at increase in forest cover in certain areas of the world and also relative decrease and no change. And so, of course, in the areas where you're seeing decrease in forest cover, that's a form of habitat loss. And it's really prevalent in parts of Africa and South America. Not so much in North America, but definitely in the Pacific Northwest. It's not really showing up on this map, but we're having massive amount of deforestation up there. Okay, we touched on invasive species last class, but exotic species, the term alien species is kind of falling out of favor, but exotic or invasive species, number of different terms for it, but basically species that are introduced, they're outside of their normal historical range, and if they're rapidly spreading and proliferating and outcompeting native species, they can be termed invasive. Some examples, kudzu vine, zebra mussel we mentioned, types of fish, silver carp is one in the Mississippi River Valley. So pollution is sort of the next thing. Oil spills are a good example. Lots of forms of pollution. Humans and really all life on Earth are bearing, toxic burden from PFOA or PFAS chemicals, different pesticides like neonicotinoids, exposure to things like PCB, DDT, dioxins. We accumulate those in our tissues over the course of our lifetime. And it, for different organisms, depending on where they are in the trophic pyramid, that may interfere with their reproductive cycles, or just their lifespan, reduce their lifespan. So, and certainly you have catastrophic pollution events like oil spills. When I was in college, the Exxon Valdez was an oil tanker that ran aground in pristine Prince William Sound in Alaska, and just immediately wiped out large numbers of marine birds, mammals, fish, invertebrates, you name it. And it's, been a long road to recovery. And it turns out that was, relative to like the Deepwater Horizon, a relatively small spill, though at the time it was, it was considered to be massive. And climate change is already, changing species distribution. We're having large tracts of forests in the Americas, really globally, but certainly in the Americas, are being subjected to bark beetles, spreading, and in some cases completing 2 life cycles, reproductive cycles in the span of 1 year, where it used to be the winter would come in and really they'd have just one chance to reproduce during the year. So they're doubling their numbers, spreading rapidly, and they're killing large tracts of forest. It's estimated the Sierra Nevada has 170 million dead trees due to drought and the effects of beetles. And then finally, overharvesting. So, just humans basically eating wild nature. So the dodo is a great example, a bird that had no, understanding that humans were a predator. And so no fear of humans whatsoever. And when we were initially exploring, the islands, Mauritius in the South Pacific, the dodo would walk right up to boats landing on shores, and people would just easily gather them, just pick them up by hand and put them in stews. Their eggs are exceptionally large, so seafaring boat captains would send groups ashore in Mauritius and just collect dodo eggs, and make omelets, and within just a short time of non-indigenous outside colonizers visiting Mauritius, the dodo went totally extinct. So we basically ate them. Bisons are another example. Here's a mound of bison skulls and a whole, really complex story of reduction of bison numbers in the United States and Canada. Passenger pigeons, harvested for food. It used to be that on the East Coast during their spring migration, they'd fly north in flocks that would block out the sun for days at a time. And people would shoot shotguns, loaded with special kind of shotgun shell that would take out, sometimes 20 or 30 passenger pigeons with one shot. And they were driven to extinction. The plume trade is not something that many students know about, but that's something that happened around the turn of the century. Is very fashionable to wear bird feathers, and in some cases whole birds, entire taxidermied mounted birds on particularly women's hats. And as a result of the plume trade, we had one of our first pieces of conservation legislation passed in the United States. So it was the Lacey Act in 1900, prohibited the transport of illegally harvested game animals, mainly birds, across state lines. And a lot of the plumes that were being worn on hats in New York City and all up and down cities on the East Coast were coming from Florida and tropical areas, some in Georgia, but definitely Florida and further south. And so the Lacey Act aimed to prohibit transport and put an end to the plume trade. And ultimately, it was made kind of a social faux pas to wear dead birds on one's hat. But nonetheless, harvesting of wild species continues. Globally, there's an international agreement, CITES, that was passed. It's a convention on international trade of endangered species, wild flora and fauna, plants and animals, passed in 1973 by 175 different nations, and the idea is to limit the trade on plants and animals, parts between countries. Not always exceptionally well enforced, but it is on the books. And so that brings us to the red list. Keeps track, basically an international body keeping track of threatened and endangered species. And each country within the IUCN has its own system for keeping track and trying to protect these. Here in the U.S., again, we have the 1972 Marine Mammal Protection Act passed to prohibit the killing of marine mammals, which was fantastic. And also a year later, the Endangered Species Act, which again, Fish and Wildlife Service determines which species are threatened with extinction and makes trading of these species illegal, and also authorizes the government to purchase land that may be helpful for maintaining populations of endangered species. 92, we had the Convention on Biological Diversity, and it's a global treaty again to try to protect, conserve biodiversity, sustainably use diverse forms of life all over the planet, such as in making pharmaceuticals, and then share the benefits of harvest of, various different plant species and, insects and that kind of thing. So, here within California, we have lots of public land. And in the effort to conserve biodiversity globally, there's been a number of different approaches, and we looked at this with the Global Safety Net video put out by Globia, just trying to set aside large tracts of wild land to protect species and protect biodiversity. We have within the U.S., we have national parks. That's our national system. We have state parks. We have local parks. Those are all, designed to conserve resources and biodiversity for people to enjoy. Globally, there's a system of biosphere reserves, and these are, typically very diverse regions that are set aside, and have a core area that's protected from any kind of harvesting or any kind of long-term human impacts. And then buffering zones as you head out from a central circle of protection, and gradually less protection as you head further from that core. So there are many, many different world biosphere reserves, and each of these have their own unique collection of plants and animals. Okay, and we're wrapping up here with a couple of final concepts. So the idea of ecotones, these are particularly important in conservation because they tend to be biologically very diverse, and they're the transition zone between two different ecosystems. So a land ecosystem to an aquatic ecosystem, all around the edge of a lake or a pond is going to be this ecotone that can be marshy and tend to have higher species than either one of the two adjacent ecosystems. And, when we preserve land, thinking about the size of the patch of land that we preserve, the shape, and the connectedness to other parcels of wildland is really important. Wildlands Network is doing lots of conservation work in this area, something to check out. And, more information here on the page if you're interested. And then just a local project, there's a proposed bridge over the 101 freeway in Agora Hills. That's a wildlife corridor, costs several $1 million, but the idea is to allow for mammals in particular to transit the 101 without any risk of being hit by cars. And so that's kind of it's controversial because it's taxpayer money, but could help particularly populations of things like mountain lions. So, okay, thanks so much. Take care.